welcome to the ninth and final episode of the Raceday review. I am Joe, as always your host. I am the NASCAR writer for LineStar, a leading DFS analytics company, and we'll be going over the championship race, the Ford EcoBoost 400 from Homestead Miami Racetrack in Homestead, Florida. The race was kind of boring, which was really kind of not my favorite idea. Everyone was talking about how much fun it would be with the new package and how this package was specifically meant for this type of racetrack, a mile and a half, to make them a little more exciting. We were going to get some high tire wear, and between the fall off, we're going to have some high tire wear fall off, and then the going from day to night, we're going to have to deal with tire pressure and all that other fun stuff. And unfortunately, we didn't really get too much of that. A big complaint of mine from this entire playoffs, especially the last 5 or 6 weeks, has been most of the passes for the lead lap. Most of the passes for the lead have come under cautions or pit stops or things like that, and that's really not too fun. We kind of saw that again today. Well, yesterday, with Harvick leading early, and then once pit stops cycled through it, things like that, then Truex ended up taking the lead. He ran away with it for a little bit until he fucked up one of his pit stops, and that kind of gave way to a couple of other things, and then before you know it, Kyle Busch was there. But we will break that all down in depth. We'll look into it a little further. See what we missed, see what we could have done. There's going to be no playoff breakdown or anything along those lines because the playoffs are over, the season is over, and Kyle Busch is our champion. So as always, we start off by going over what our targets were, who was in the perfect lineup, and who were in the winning lineups. So going into this season, going into this final race, I always like to look at the perfect lineups that are available for the last couple of races. I usually do a 3-year window, mostly because a lot of the long-term drivers have been here for 3 years, or much more than 3 years. Then you have a couple of the intermediate guys, which some guys picked up in 2016, some guys started 17, some guys started in 18. So you really get about three-quarters of the field who you can get a nice long history on. If I go 4 to 5 years, that'll really start narrowing them down. And then guys like Bubba Wallace, William Byron, Daniel Suarez, who've all come on in the last couple of years, they only really had 2 to 3 years worth of data to look at, so I keep everyone in more recent form. And what I realized is, as I went through before, at the end of the last video, was playoff drivers are going to matter. Every year that this playoff system has been in effect, the winner of the championship needed to win the race, and I expected that to happen again today. One interesting thing that I did find is that the dominator didn't always come from the championship 4. You would normally have a dominator who was outside the top 4, but then the race winner would come from a top 4 guy. So what I was really looking at is I wanted about at least two dominators, or 2 drivers that I thought would either win the race or lead more than, I think I made the cutoff about 80 laps. And there were some times that there were 3 drivers that led about 70 to 80 laps in between. No true absolute dominator ran away with it. So you could fit in like a 3 driver in the top 10 lineup, and that really forced us to use a stars and scrubs kind of combination. The reasoning behind that is because weather was terrible. All of Friday afternoons, activities were rained out. Both practices were supposed to be Friday, and then qualifying was supposed to be Saturday. NASCAR decided that instead of only having qualifying on Saturday and not giving these teams any time to practice, they decided that they were going to set the field via not driver points, but owner points. And then they would wipe out Saturday's qualifying and only do one single practice. So the top 4 started in the top 4, and that made things a lot interesting. The top 10 drivers were all very, very expensive. You got a couple, I think William Byron was 80-something hundred. So you had one guy less than 900. Well, let's go to I have the salaries set up in my model today. So the top 10 were from Clint Boyer on. So you had Boyer at 88, you had Byron at 84. Everyone else was more than 9,000. So you're going to spend at least 30,000. So that's about 60% of your cap on 50% of your team. So you kind of had to balance it out, and you can go as high as 34,000 if you pick three very expensive guys. If you go with Kyle Busch, Hamlin, and Larson, which would have been not the best strategy. Not even looking from hindsight, from very beginning, it wasn't a great strategy. But you could have done that, and altogether it would have been about $3,300. So you would have spent a good chunk, about 66, 2/3 of your money, on just three of your six drivers, and that would have left you with not a lot of room to spare. So I was thinking of stars and scrubs was going to be the way to go, because I really wanted at least two and mostly three. And then there weren't too many other trends that I could spot. You could kind of go, and as long as a driver finished in the top 30, and I knew I was going to need at least one guy, maybe two guys starting in the bottom 10. As long as I could get the one very very cheap driver to pick up about 7, 8, 9 spots and finish in the top 30, and then I could kind of fit my way in between. I can make some good. I made a couple of good looking lineups that were very stars and scrubs-ish, except for the fact that Kyle Larson decided to blow his engine, and that put a torpedo in a lot of my day, but me and everyone else. He was very highly talked about. So that's where I was looking at. It was about 2 to 3 drivers starting in the top 10 that were going to be able to either lead laps or win the race, and then depending if it was 2 or 3, I'd get 3 or 4 drivers pretty much scattered around that kind of fit, usually most likely low price drivers that I would be able to get in there. They really made a no man's land between like $8,000 and $9,500 that I didn't have too much exposure to, basically because they were all starting between like 7th and 20th, and I didn't think they had dominator potential, and they didn't really practice that well. So there's a real dead spot in the pricing this week. Not really because of the pricing, just because of the way lineup construction shook out. So let's see how I hit with that. Well, right off the bat, Eric Jones started 16th in the 8,000 to 9,500 price range, and ends up in the perfect lineup because he finished third. So that pretty much tells you how my weekend went. But so we had just a broad overview of how things shook out. We had 2 drivers start in the top 10. Both of them actually happened to be playoff drivers. There was no non-playoff driver that was a dominator, so those two bucked the trend a little bit. Then I had a driver that was very cheap, starting 30th, that picked up some spots, and that checked that one off. And then a couple of 2 cheap drivers I thought I'd be able to. I really wasn't expecting. We'll go over Austin Dillon, but the big pivot and the big difference between a lot of my lineups personally and what I advocated for and what actually happened was you ended up cutting Eric Jones out and cutting Austin Dillon out and just getting a couple extra $100 and going to a driver that's around about $1,500-$1,600. You get a $10,000 driver for Jones, and then just drop Dillon down to a driver in like the high 5,000s, and that's where a lot of my roster constructions managed. It was not the optimal construction. Only 2 dominators happened, and 2 dominators with the top 10. So we decided that worked out pretty well. But rounding out the middle of the lineup didn't. It was where the difference made it. The perfect lineup was not the winning lineup to the 2 big contests. The only difference there was that they all rostered David Reagan, who was very highly owned, relatively. He was in the 20-25% owned. Instead of Nemechek, you had the extra money on the table. They put a little extra money on the table and just didn't do Nemechek. So to go driver by driver, Eric Jones is the first driver that was listed on the perfect lineup. He started 16th. He started 16th. He finished third. He had 6 fastest laps, no laps led, and his average. He ran in the top 10 as an average finishing as a average run position. Jones, not great at Homestead. Average finish position of 24th. He usually qualifies well and drops back. He ran pretty far back the entire time. Similar tracks this year, and I had 15 similar tracks, all the 1.5 miles plus. Dover was in there, and Michigan, which is a 2 mile track, was in there. So there were some. There was a big sample size that we pulled for the similar. His average finish at similar tracks was 13.6, and we have to remember that is with him absolutely blowing up at some tracks, just really shit in the bed. So all in all, he had a nice average finishing position at similar tracks. Sorry, I just thought they were all the same color. So back to where we were, average run position right around his finishing position. So he really, when he did well, he did well. His single lap time was 10th best. His 10 lap average was 14th best. Starting 16, he had some upside. I projected him to be finished 14th. I thought his top finish was 11th. So I did want some exposure to him, and I did have some exposure to him. And every time I play him, he crashes. Every time I fade him, he pulls out for third place. So I was done. I proclaimed myself done with Eric Jones about 8 weeks ago, and I held strong to that. Didn't work out well this race. He always has decent upside, especially at these types of tracks, but you just never know what you're going to get for him. And for the last race of the season, I didn't want Eric Jones to give me the bad taste in my mouth. The number one dominator, and I went very deep into this in the article that I write for Line Star. I try to pick one guy. I've never mentioned it here, but the way that I like to construct my article is I like to recommend guys that you can at least build a team out of. It would have been very easy for me to recommend all 4 playoff drivers left, and then you literally could build a team with the salary that you had left. And what is that going to happen? So I try to get a couple of cheap guys that I think, like the cash plays, a cheap cash play guy, a expensive cash play guy, then some drivers with some tournament upside, and then a couple of drivers that you can fill out the lineup with. And normally I'll make sure that their salaries jive so that you can build a lineup just from the recommendations itself. Now I recommend more than 6 drivers, so you have some leeway, and then I also release my cheat sheet that has some projections and things like that. So there you have I try to unleash a lot of different information, but the philosophy I like to make is I subscribe to some other people's content just to see what there's going, get a feel of what people are talking about and how other projections chop up to how mine are. And there are a lot of other content providers that were recommending 3 of the 4 championship 4, and a lot of people left Truex out, which I thought was kind of interesting because I like Truex to win. I thought that he had the best chance of winning. My model actually predicted the model that I released. I've run a couple of them. I've mentioned that before. I have about 10. I have 10 different projections that I set. The one that I find most accurate for the race, I then publish. So the model that I have had Busch and Truex finishing 1 in 5, and Busch ended up winning, and that's who I thought this model specifically thought would win. But I had overall between all of the ones that I produced, they had a winner out of 3 of the 4 playoff drivers. Oddly enough, they didn't have Truex winning at all. But he was actually my favorite to win, mostly because the race started in the day and ended in the night, and he has been dominant on races that do that. of the 3 races. All 3 playoff drivers had different reasons to like them. And I went through all of it. I'll kind of go through it with you guys too. Hamlin starting on the pole, as clean air was king in this package, and I thought as long as he could hold off Harvick and get a good restart, he had a good chance to lead a decent amount of laps. He had a rocket ship last week, but last week is different than this week because you had two of the only 2 drivers that needed to win last week. Hamlin won and Kyle Busch was second. They raced their ass off. The other 2 guys didn't need to win, so they just kind of coasted. So I didn't want to go too heavily into super recent form because, I mean, the whole playoffs, they were all racing against each other, so recent form does help. But I wasn't going to tip it to Hamlin just because of last week's performance. And he's started on the pole something like 3 of the last 4 races and hasn't led more than 40 laps. He can lead laps. He did lead 40 laps in one of those races, but he's not someone who is an automatic start when he gets up there, especially when he had the 3 other playoff drivers behind him. Championship drivers, playoff drivers, interchangeable. They're long words, so I kind of mix them up. So he had 3 very fast cars behind him. All of them were gunning for his neck. So I thought if he could stay and lead not mess up one of his restart or the start of the race, he'd be able to at least hold on for a little bit. He didn't really mess it up, but Harvick was just so much faster than him. Hamlin had great 10-lap average, but then his fall off between the 10 to 15-lap average was absolutely ridiculous. And Truex was awesome on the 15-lap average. He was about, I want to say, a half a second faster overall in 15 laps over Hamlin, which was impressive only because Hamlin was faster than him after 10. So really, the difference between the 11th and the 15th lap was stark. So I really liked Truex's chances. I liked the fact that he didn't. The race goes from day to night. That's always been a thing for him. Kevin Harvick, Truex didn't have the greatest average finishing position here, which is always stressful. He qualifies well and finishes poorly. His average running position was better than Hamlin's, but not nearly as good as the other 2. He had the best average finishing position at similar tracks, which is what I really tipped it in his favor for me. And then he had the second best average run position. So his single lap speed was good. His 10-lap average was good. His 15-lap average was the best. I really like Truex, and apparently a lot of other people did. He was like 45% owned in the $4 and like 52% owned in the $11. I was very surprised about that, considering that he didn't get talked up a lot, especially in other tout sites. I didn't end up writing him up. I wrote up all the things that I liked about him in my article, but he was not one of my picks. I mentioned some things about him in chat, and I mentioned that I liked him to win the race. So I did express my interest in him, but I read some other site stuff, and they weren't on Truex, which I was very shocked about. So I thought I'd get some good leverage on him because I advocated for ownership of all of these guys. I wanted about I set my ownership to 40 to 60% of Harvick because I thought that he would be the driver that dominated from the championship 4. I thought he had a very good car. I thought his car was sneaky good. He was more of a gut play. The reason I say that is Harvick's single lap time was only the 9th best, and his 10-lap average was only the 7th best. So he actually didn't do very well in practice, but something about him told me that he was actually the driver to have. Fortunately, he led laps. He was able to overtake Hamlin, and then he used the clean air to his advantage until he lost the lead when he cycled through pit stops. So I thought Harvick was going to be the driver who led the most laps, and he had the clean air as opposed to Hamlin. So I thought that his car would have done a little better, but it turned out his car really wasn't that great. So once he lost the clean air, that was pretty much the end of his day. He was riding up there for a long time. Uh, his average position was fourth, so he was in the top four for most of the time. He led. He had 37 fastest laps, so he really did a good job, and he led about 15% of the laps, which I actually have written down. No reason to do math. It was 41 laps, so not great, but and he didn't get into the perfect lineup, so he was a tough guy to have my highest exposure to, but I had about 50% Harvick, about 45% Truex, about 40% Kyle Busch, and then I had 40% Kyle Busch, about 40% Kyle Larson, and then about 30% Hamlin. So I suggested that you play a little bit of both of all these guys because they are all very good drivers and they would all also be highly owned. So you want to. It really would have sucked if you took a stand on Hamlin and had him blow up. Don't know why you would take a stand on Hamlin. I never suggested that at any means. I actually had him fifth. I thought Larson would do better than Hamlin, but so did everyone else. And then Larson decided to blow his engine, which hurt. But Kyle Busch is always talked about. He's always a favorite at Homestead. His average finishing position at Homestead was fourth. He had over 100 laps led in 3 of the last 4 races here, so he was, I believe so. That might have been the last. That might have been the last lap at Phoenix, but either way, he's always been very good here. He is great at similar tracks. He hasn't won. He didn't. The biggest thing anyone ever talked about is he didn't win at 1.5 mile track this year, and he hasn't won in a couple of weeks. And God forbid it was like 21 weeks or something. They made a big deal about that. He's the winningest driver of the 2010s. So trust me, he didn't. This was a drought by his standard, but by no one else's. He was fast. He had the best single lap average and the second best 10 lap average, so he was good over both the short and the long run. And he also, I think he had like a top 3 15 lap average, so he was good all around. And he ended up winning. He ended up winning the race, leading 120 laps and finishing in the perfect lineup. Now Nemechek. There are a couple of different ways to attack this side of the field. I'm just going to go, for this, I'm going to sort it by salary. So, this salary range has been killing me. It's hard to write things about. I wrote up BJ McLeod, and that is because he was dirt cheap. Like stone cold minimum. He didn't run well. He didn't anything like that. But as long as he didn't absolutely blow up, he would pick you up some points. He finished 32nd. He didn't make it into my criteria of starting in the 30s and finishing in the 20s. But for the price, he would be able to at least provide a floor for the cash games, and that was my like about him. Reed Sorensen, I had no interest, or he was more expensive from BJ McLeod and didn't practice any better. So there's always that. So he started a one spot further back, but at that point, what's the difference? JJ Yelly's, this whole area. I had some interest in Castle because we haven't gotten him at under 5,000 in a while. His average finishing position at Homestead is 25th, which made my ears perk up. This year, he's just been terrible. His average similar finishing position is 31.6, so that is just pitiful. He practiced poorly. He started 33rd. He finished 28th, so he picked up some spots. There's really nothing much I could tell you about that I didn't have, but for $4,800, he had more downside than McLeod and not as much upside, so it's hard. This whole section was tough. Josh Bilicki wasn't on my radar. Corey LaJoy, because of the way that they sorted out points, he ended up starting 29th, so that was a little tad bit too high for me. McDowell actually had some good things. He had a nice average finish. Didn't really do well at similar tracks this year. Practiced okay, but starting 28th, he just didn't have the upside for me at that point. I would always suggest to go down. Drew Herring was a darling of the industry, but actually went a lot lower owned than I expected. I was hoping, which is, I didn't expect him to be high owned because he had zero name recognition, and I expected him to go a little more owned because people who in the industry knew who was. So anyone who listened to touts and reads articles and things like that would know who Drew Herring was. He's a simulation driver for one of the top teams, and they gave him a car at one of the lesser teams. So he had a good funding, decent enough funding. This was his first run. He never ran here. I don't know where I got this. I just made up numbers for him, to be honest with you. I saw what his practice times were, and I just kind of made that going. Starting 37th, he was actually kind of a little more expensive than we would have liked, but I had a lot of him. Chastain, I had a decent amount, but David Reagan was really the darling of this. Anyone who didn't know who Herring was would roster then Reagan, because everyone knows who Reagan is. He got the name recognition. It was his last race as a full-time driver, 5,700. His average finishing position was 22nd here. His average similar finishing position is 24.6. He didn't practice well, but starting 31st, that's all he really needed. And I split a lot of my ownership between Reagan, then I would drop down to Herring, and if not, I would just go all the way down to McLeod. Wallace was also a very interesting option for me. I skipped over Nemechek entirely. I noticed he ran well last race. That's the only similar track that he ran. But considering he didn't practice well, I'd rather not go for unknowns. He ended up in the perfect lineup, but the perfect lineup didn't end up winning anything. So you could have. I think that's probably the only lineup construction that was better than the ones that did win. So perfect lineup or bust. But at that point, since Reagan was cheaper and better known, then people just played Reagan, and that was that. Wallace was an interesting choice. He always is an interesting choice. His average finishing position here was 21st, and he averaged picking up some spots. He practiced terribly again. Practice was just, the last couple of weeks, practice was just not great. I had him as a projected finishing position of 27th, but I had him as a ceiling of 19th and a floor of 27th. So he was all floor with some ceiling, and that's what I enjoyed about him. He didn't run well. He ended up having a problem with the tire go down, I believe, and that's what pushed him back. And he finished the race, but that wasn't anything he wanted. Priest was an interesting driver. His single lap average wasn't terrible, starting 26th. He actually finished 25th. He does better the second time around, so I'll keep my eye on him for the March race next year. When the next time they go to Homestead, it's going to be a quick turnaround, and I think he'll be able to use what he did now. Plus, these were all the top drivers for the top. Everyone was racing hard. It was the last race of the year, so he probably might be able to make a couple of more passes next year, and maybe not get lapped as quickly. There were no cautions, so there were only 3 cautions for 15 laps. That's almost nothing. That is literally nothing. It's the 2 stage breaks plus 1 extra one. So that's really, wasn't a lot of problems. The biggest reason people were more than 10 laps down is because they got lapped a lot. There are 2 cars that had issues, Byron and Larson. They both blew their engines. And that's really the only issues they had. Truex's issue is they put the wrong goddamn tires on, but he was even able to unlap himself and finish second, or he just would have ran away with the lead and probably bumped out Kyle Busch. Didn't talk about that at all. Truex could have won this race and led like 230 laps, probably about 220. If it wasn't for his pit crew putting on the wrong tires. Even with that happening, he still led 100 laps and finished second. So he had easily the best car the entire time, and he could have, just that one mistake cost a whole lot of time. His lead was so high that he was able to make 2 pit stops and still only lose 1 lap, which is unheard of, especially at a mile-and-a-half track. If you pit stop once after green, you're down a lap. He pit stopped twice, and he only went down a lap. And everyone was talking about how, oh, that's so great. At least he had a good lead. He was only down 1 lap. He was able to bounce back and still win second. It was a distant second. He was even gaining on Kyle Busch, but Kyle Busch had opened up such an amazing lead that, sure, what was the difference between losing by 7 seconds and 4 seconds? If there was another 50 laps, maybe he would have been able to make up those 4 seconds. But overall, the championship was literally decided on 2 guys one guy putting on the wrong goddamn tires. Like, that's how exciting this race was. But that just kind of sounds like sour grapes, because I had a lot of Kyle Larson and a lot of Martin Truex Jr., and only one of them panned out. But it is what it is. I don't know how we got to that tangent off of talking about John Hunter Nemechek. I will never know. But my number 1 driver that I wrote up this weekend, and doesn't make it often onto my article, and oddly enough, he was even the one promoted when Line Star retweeted out the article. But Daniel Hemrick, he has made his entire season on qualifying well and falling back, so I don't ever roster him ever in the history of ever. But I do like it when he doesn't qualify well. And since there was no qualifying, there wasn't no chance for him to overshoot his load. And starting 25th, he had a better 10-lap average and a better single-lap time. His average finishing position at similar tracks was 22nd, so not really that much better, but his average place differential was minus 3.5. So that's the way of looking about it. So again, he qualifies well, falls back. This time he didn't qualify well, so I was hoping that he would fall forward. I've had a projected finishing position of 22nd, but I thought that was a little light. I really liked his floor ceiling combination. I thought a top 15 would have been enough to get him in the perfect lineup. The difference between finishing 12th and 16th is a good number of points, but I think he still would have ended up making it there. But I thought he was a high floor, high ceiling driver. There weren't a lot of drivers that I projected to pick up more than a handful of laps, and he was right in the price range that I needed, and I projected him to pick up some spots. So I thought he was, as far as a cash game play, I thought he was the cash game player in this price range. You know, Wallace always makes me queasy. Priest does a little better when he runs it a second time, so I wasn't going to put all of my stock into that. Ty Dillon was priced up, but he's been running well. He didn't practice well in his starting 24th. I didn't like the where he was starting. I projected him to finish 25th. He actually stayed and finished 24th. He was another driver who had a high floor, high ceiling combination, but between the price, when it was a 1-to-1 between Ty Dillon and Daniel Hemrick, I chose Hemrick, basically because Hemrick has some sort of history of finishing in the top 12, the top 20s. Ty Dillon's good. He's a good driver. He's in shitty equipment. I enjoy rostering him. I enjoy everything about him. But Ty Dillon's great when he's did something in qualifying and goes from 34th to 21st. Like that's what I really want to stock up on Ty Dillon. When he's starting 24th and I need him to get to 15th, he's a little stressful. Buescher has been awesome at 1.5 mile tracks. Buescher I've been on for a while. I always think of him and DiBenedetto as two of a kind. And the real differentiation, I'm sorry, I keep scratching my head, but it is what it is. The big difference between Buescher and DiBenedetto in my eyes is Buescher this year has been absolutely amazing at 1.5 mile tracks and similar tracks. So all of those types of tracks are where he really differentiated himself. Where DiBenedetto made his money this year, well, relative money. Think of it this way: last year I could get both of these guys in the Bubba Wallace range, and right now one's criminally underpriced at 6,700, and then I think DiBenedetto was a little overpriced at 7,600, considering the drivers around him. But when we're at a funky track, a road course, a short track, a even the restrictor plate tracks or the super speedways, whatever you want to call them, that's when I really enjoy rostering DiBenedetto. But for the extra $800, it is not $900. It is not worth it. I think Buescher was the much better play of the two. I always think of them in my mind. For some reason, they were always tied. It's either one or the other. But the way that I sorted it out this year and the way it actually worked out for me. So let's see. DiBenedetto started 21st, finished 20th. I had him as a projected finish at 24th. Again, a nice ceiling of 11th. Chris Buescher started 20th, finished 16th, so he picked up some spots. I had him as a higher ceiling and a higher floor combination. My projection for him was actually 22nd. So the model that I published had him finishing better than DiBenedetto, and I think he did. He was the better option than DiBenedetto, but not to the degree. Again, one of the more times that I would look at the ceiling floor combination as opposed to the raw projection. But either or, unless I have my average here, I don't really talk about that too often. I had his average projection of 14.6, and DiBenedetto's is 18. So for the money, I preferred Buescher over DiBenedetto. It worked out well for me relatively. Buescher didn't do anything amazing, but he was there. Ricky Stenhouse Jr., average finish position of 20.3. He, again, another driver that qualifies very well here but falls back, but still has top 20 potential. He's been very good at similar tracks this year, but again, by qualifying well. He didn't practice well. Starting 23rd, I thought he would finish 17th, which was a ceiling. He ended up finishing 19th. He picked up some spots, but for the money, Buescher was the play there. I had some shares of him. Austin Dillon, very good here, but he was very good at Phoenix also, and he didn't do well. Having a terrible year. His average finish of 17.4 doesn't quite put into perspective how bad he's been, especially at times that I needed him to. He was starting 22nd, and I had him as a projected finish position of 12th. I did have him a top five ceiling projection. I didn't have a lot of as much of him as I really would have liked. I ended up going with a little more Suarez. I thought Suarez would be much lower owned because he was racing for something. He has a terrible Homestead average, but he actually was running very well at similar tracks this year. And he was actually starting further forward at 17th. I predicted him to finish 18th. Again, drivers that I really liked this particular model didn't really pop off for him. He finished right around where his projection was. I've thoroughly thought that he had more upside than he did. Let me see what his average run position was. His average run position was 16, so he really didn't get anywhere near what I thought he was going to. I ended up pivoting to him. I had a little extra money, and I paid up for Suarez instead of taking Dillon. I know I skipped over Menard entirely. I'll get there in a second. But going in and doing my research, I really enjoyed Austin Dillon. I thought that he'd be a good option, but I was also worried about him biting me in the ass just like the last couple of races. He ended up being the play finally. You go to the well one more time. Menard had an average finish position of 18th here. Average similar finishing of 15.8. Single lap time was good. 10 lap average not as good. He started 19th, so right around a lot of the other drivers. He was an option. So I'm gonna go through the rest of these guys quickly. because this is right around the no man's land that I mentioned. Johnson was an option just because of his finishing his history here and starting 18th, but I didn't like him too much because he didn't practice very well and his wasn't great here this year. Newman was starting too far forward for me at 15th. He actually finished 7th, so he did well. But he practiced terribly, like he always does. So it was really more of track position and things like that. I didn't like Byron because of starting 9th and his poor finishing. I didn't expect him to blow out his engine, but he did. Um, Clint Boyer again started too far forward. Kurt Busch didn't have the upside. I had some Keselowski because he was cheaper than Blaney. He had the ability to lead laps here, so I had some upside. I was really looking for a non-playoff dominator, and I narrowed that down to Keselowski, Logano, and Larson. Not in that order. I thought Larson was going to be much better than the other two, and he really was when he was running. Larson had 20 fastest laps. Blaney actually had 19. Good for him. Logano only had 1. I really thought that Larson had the best car, and he did for the good long run. But when his car blew up on him at the last pit stop, that really just sealed and put a nail in his coffin. He went scored minus 20 DraftKings points, which was just absolutely brutal considering that no one else went negative. Byron went negative, but still, if you didn't have either one of those two drivers, you were, yeah, that was just an absolute brutal way to end the season. But that's how his season started. So that's really, it's not, he was riding such a hot streak that I had avoided, he really, it still just hurts to think about. But, and also my son's awake and now standing in his crib and playing around, so I gotta get him in a minute. But Larson started this entire season absolutely terribly, and then turned it around, has been having a great second half of the year, and he had a great car, a super fast car. He was battling for the lead. He was trying to make passes. He was in the top 3 for most of the time when he was running. He had a bunch of fastest laps as we saw, and he really, I thought that he had a chance to really put up a big number today, and unfortunately got snake bit again, just like the beginning of his season, and that's how we pretty much ended 2019. So I know I skipped over some drivers. Overall, fairly boring race. I just want to take the time to thank everyone for watching, streaming, looking at YouTube, going onto YouTube and checking it out there, watching as we go along. I thought this was going to be a quick one because I don't have any playoffs to talk about, and I didn't have any look forward for next race, because next race is next season. I do love the Daytona 500. Maybe I'll bring this back for then. If not, this might be the last episode. As always, if you liked it, reach out to me on Twitter, reach out to me on YouTube, anything Twitch. They don't really have a messaging chance, but you can always put a message in one of the videos and I'll get a notification. And thank you. I hope you enjoyed the season, and I can't wait for 2020.